The fall of the Federation. The story begins with a reflection by our protagonist, a member of a peaceful race known as the Tans. Once a flourishing civilization, the Tans were known for their advancements in science, commerce, and the arts. They were an optimistic and curious people, constantly striving to expand their knowledge and explore the farthest reaches of space. The Tans had successfully developed faster-than-light (FTL) travel, allowing them to explore new worlds and meet other intelligent species. Their first encounters were peaceful. They met two neighboring races, and together, they formed what would later become the United Races Federation, a symbol of unity, cooperation, and shared progress. The Federation grew as more species were encountered, each eager to join this alliance of peace and prosperity. But things changed when the Self Empire arrived. The Self were not interested in diplomacy, science, or trade. They were conquerors, a vicious race of hunters who thrived on war and subjugation. Their sole purpose was domination, and their method was simple: overwhelm, conquer, and extract resources. Diplomacy was met with scorn, and when the Federation's attempts to negotiate peace failed, it became clear that the Self had no interest in coexistence. The Federation was woefully unprepared for the ferocity of the Self. Within less than a year, all 12 member races of the Federation had been forced to surrender unconditionally. Their worlds were plundered and their people enslaved. Factories were repurposed to produce goods for the Self Empire, and the Tans' once brilliant scientists were now nothing more than slaves, forced to work for their new masters. The protagonist, a former diplomat, reflects on the hopelessness of the situation. Their people had been thoroughly conquered, and now their very existence was tied to the whims of the Self. Thousands of their kind were taken each year, never to be seen again, rumored to be butchered and eaten by the Self. Their only way of survival was through submission, as the Self had mastered the art of breaking their slaves. The protagonist's role as a translator for the Self is a bitter irony. The Tans had been the ones to develop the universal translators, tools that once brought races together in peace. Now, those same devices were being used to help the Self conquer others. It's their job to calibrate these translators for each new race the Self discover, ensuring that the demands for surrender are properly communicated. There is no diplomacy, no chance of negotiation, only the chilling words of submission and conquest. As the protagonist watches the brutal subjugation of race after race, they can only wonder how long this cycle will continue. Their once bright hope for the future had all but dimmed, now reduced to a dull, constant despair. The fall of the Federation. The story begins with a reflection by our protagonist, a member of a peaceful race known as the Tans. Once a flourishing civilization, the Tans were known for their advancements in science, commerce, and the arts. They were an optimistic and curious people, constantly striving to expand their knowledge and explore the farthest reaches of space. The Tans had successfully developed faster-than-light (FTL) travel, allowing them to explore new worlds and meet other intelligent species. Their first encounters were peaceful. They met two neighboring races, and together, they formed what would later become the United Races Federation, a symbol of unity, cooperation, and shared progress. The Federation grew as more species were encountered, each eager to join this alliance of peace and prosperity. But things changed when the Self Empire arrived. The Self were not interested in diplomacy, science, or trade. They were conquerors, a vicious race of hunters who thrived on war and subjugation. Their sole purpose was domination, and their method was simple: overwhelm, conquer, and extract resources. Diplomacy was met with scorn, and when the Federation's attempts to negotiate peace failed, it became clear that the Self had no interest in coexistence. The Federation was woefully unprepared for the ferocity of the Self. Within less than a year, all 12 member races of the Federation had been forced to surrender unconditionally. Their worlds were plundered and their people enslaved. Factories were repurposed to produce goods for the Self Empire, and the Tans' once brilliant scientists were now nothing more than slaves, forced to work for their new masters. The protagonist, a former diplomat, reflects on the hopelessness of the situation. Their people had been thoroughly conquered, and now their very existence was tied to the whims of the Sulf. Thousands of their kind were taken each year, never to be seen again, rumored to be butchered and eaten by the Sulf. Their only way of survival was through submission, as the Sulf had mastered the art of breaking their slaves. The protagonist's role as a translator for the Sulf is a bitter irony. The Tans had been the ones to develop the universal translators, tools that once brought races together in peace. Now those same devices were being used to help the Sulf conquer others. It's their job to calibrate these translators for each new race the Sulf discover, ensuring that the demands for surrender are properly communicated. There is no diplomacy, no chance of negotiation, only the chilling words of submission and conquest. As the protagonist watches the brutal subjugation of race after race, they can only wonder how long this cycle will continue. Their once bright hope for the future had all but dimmed, now reduced to a dull, constant despair, the hopeless situation. For nearly 2 decades, the protagonist has served as a translator aboard a Sulf flagship, witnessing the same grim routine over and over. Each new race encountered by the Sulf is met with overwhelming force, their territories invaded, and their societies torn apart. The protagonist's job has turned from an honorable role into a bitter mockery, forced to watch as each race is systematically broken and absorbed into the Sulf Empire. They reflect on their position within this brutal hierarchy. Officially, they hold the title of diplomat, but there is no real diplomacy with the Sulf. Their only purpose is to assist the invaders, ensuring their demands for submission are clearly communicated to newly discovered species. In every encounter, they shrink into the background, watching helplessly as the powerful warships rain destruction upon innocent worlds. The protagonist's race, the Tans, now exists under complete domination. They are forced to live in servitude, their resources and technology constantly extracted by the Sulf. Factories that once produced goods for trade and progress now churn out supplies and weapons for their captors. The brilliant minds of the Tans are enslaved, forced to design new technologies for the Empire. Every day, the Sulf's grip tightens, and the few who resist disappear, likely taken to be used as food, the ultimate insult and dehumanization. The weight of hopelessness bears down on the protagonist. They have watched race after race fall, powerless to intervene. The Sulf Empire's strength is unmatched, and the Federation, once a beacon of cooperation, is a distant memory. In moments of solitude, the protagonist dares to dream of a race strong enough to resist the Sulf, a race that could challenge their power and break the chains of slavery for all those under the Empire's heel. But after 20 years, those dreams seem like mere fantasy. The Sulf are conquerors unmatched in brutality, and any hope of freedom seems like a fleeting illusion. Their job as a translator only deepens the bitterness. Each time the Sulf invade a new world, they are forced to calibrate the translator, assisting in the Empire's communication of terms for surrender. They watch as the once strong resolve of proud civilizations is ground into dust, their leaders forced to beg for mercy. The weight of responsibility eats away at the protagonist, knowing they play a part, however unwilling, in the destruction of these species. As they stand on the bridge of the Sulf flagship, listening to the chilling commands for submission, they wonder how much longer they can endure this cycle of violence and domination. Hope feels like a distant memory, buried under the suffocating weight of slavery. And yet, deep down, a flicker remains, small and fragile, but there nonetheless. Perhaps one day they will witness the downfall of the Sulf, but for now, they are trapped in a system of endless conquest, forced to serve the very empire that destroyed their people. A glimmer of hope. After years of witnessing defeat after defeat, the protagonist's monotony is suddenly shattered. Rumors begin to circulate among the Sulf crew aboard the flagship. A new race has been encountered, a race so formidable that the Imperial First Army has been unable to conquer them alone. This is unprecedented. The Sulf never struggled to defeat new civilizations, and yet this time they have called for reinforcements. Curiosity and a faint spark of hope ignite within the protagonist. Could this be the race they had long dreamed of? Could these new beings stand against a Sulf where so many others had failed? As the fleet heads to the coordinates of this mysterious species, the protagonist begins to eavesdrop on the conversations among the Sulf officers. The name of this race is whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration: the Terrans. The Terrans, it seems, are unlike anything the Sulf have encountered before. Not only do they control dozens of planets, but they have also managed to repel the First Army from their territory. Even more astonishing, the Second Army had boldly attempted to subdue the Terrans, only to meet the same fate, defeated and forced to retreat. For the first time in living memory, the Sulf are struggling to conquer an enemy. The protagonist can hardly believe what they are hearing. The Sulf, who have terrorized the galaxy for decades, are now facing an opponent that they cannot easily overpower. This new race, the Terrans, seems to have the strength, technology, and determination to challenge the Sulf Empire. As the fleet draws closer to Terran space, more information is uploaded into the ship's computers, and the protagonist is tasked with preparing the translator to communicate with the Terran language. While working on the translation machine, the protagonist discovers something even more remarkable. The Imperial First Army's flagship had been completely destroyed by the Terrans. This alone is a staggering revelation. The First Army is a force of unparalleled might, feared throughout the galaxy. For their flagship to be obliterated means the Terrans are not just resilient, they are dangerous. As the protagonist delves deeper into the Terran data, they find themselves captivated. For the first time in decades, they feel a genuine surge of hope. The Terrans are more than just survivors, they are warriors, and their ships are massive, bristling with weapons, and built for war. The Sulf may have finally met their match. When the fleet finally reaches Terran territory, the scene is awe-inspiring. The Sulf ships, which once appeared so menacing and formidable, now seem dwarfed by the sheer size and number of the Terran vessels. Thousands of sleek, gun-little grey warships fill the void of space, each one more imposing than the last. The protagonist stands at the viewport, staring in awe at the display of military might. For the first time, the Sulf are hesitant. The growling confidence of the Sulf captain is replaced with a subtle edge of unease. The plan, it seems, is no longer to conquer immediately. The Sulf are now considering a ceasefire, something that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Though the ceasefire is only intended as a temporary measure while the Sulf gather reinforcements or seek a technological advantage, the fact that they are even considering it shows how formidable the Terrans truly are. The Sulf diplomatic mission. As the Sulf fleet reaches the edge of Terran territory, the air aboard the flagship is tense. The once arrogant Sulf captain now wears a grim expression, clearly unnerved by the sheer power of the Terran forces waiting just beyond their border. The crew, too, have fallen silent, no longer filled with their usual bristling confidence. The only sound is the low hum of the ship's systems and the occasional mutter from the crew as they exchange uneasy glances. The protagonist, stationed at the translator console, is given orders to finalize the translation software for the upcoming negotiations. But even as they work, their mind races with a new plan. If the Terrans are strong enough to repel the Sulf, a diplomatic solution must be avoided at all costs. Any ceasefire would give the Sulf time to regroup, gather more forces, and eventually crush the Terrans. The protagonist knows that for their people and the galaxy as a whole, this is the one chance to defeat the Sulf. When the Terran fleet finally makes contact, they demand that the Sulf delegation meet aboard one of their ships. It's a clear show of dominance, one that the Sulf captain grudgingly agrees to, though not without a snarl. The protagonist, along with the Sulf captain, his second-in-command, 2 Sulf shock troopers, and a few other aides, are ordered to prepare for the diplomatic meeting. As the group boards a shuttle to the Terran flagship, the protagonist can't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. Terrans, the race that might be their salvation, are just minutes away. The Terran ship is enormous, far larger than the Sulf vessels, with clean, imposing lines and bristling weaponry. As they dock, the Sulf captain and his retinue disembark, but their usual swagger is absent. They are greeted by a squad of Terran soldiers, and the difference between the two species becomes immediately apparent. The Terran soldiers are enormous, towering over the Sulf, with heavy armor that looks as if it could withstand any attack. Even the Sulf shock troopers, who are considered among the most fearsome of their kind, seem small and frail next to the hulking Terran warriors. The Terrans move with calm, practiced efficiency, disarming the Sulf delegation without a word. Their sheer physical presence is intimidating, and the Sulf are uncharacteristically quiet as they are led deeper into the ship. The protagonist, however, is paying close attention to every detail. The Terrans are formidable, that much is clear. Their soldiers are disciplined, their ship is a fortress, and their technology is at least on par with the Sulf. But more than that, the Terrans exude a confidence that the Sulf have never encountered before. These aren't just warriors, they're a force to be reckoned with. The delegation is led into a large meeting room where a group of Terran leaders are waiting. The room is austere but functional, with a massive table separating the two sides. On the Terran side sit three figures, an admiral, two captains, and a diplomat. Their presence is commanding, but they remain calm, almost casual, as they wait for the Sulf to take their seats. The Sulf captain growls under his breath as he sits, clearly irritated by the power dynamic. But the tension rises further when the Terran diplomat announces that they will need to wait for one more participant, the lady governor of the planet that the Sulf forces had attacked before the Terran fleet arrived. The Sulf second in command, impatient and insulted, snarls at the suggestion. "We command the warships, not some governor," he growls. But the Terran diplomat responds calmly, explaining that the lady governor has every right to be here, having lost many civilians in the Sulf's unprovoked attack. Moments later, the doors to the meeting room swing open with a thunderous crash, and the lady governor enters. The entire room falls silent as she strides in, her presence dominating the space. She is enormous, standing well over 8 feet tall, with a physique that makes even the massive Terran soldiers seem small in comparison. Her dark, wild hair frames a face etched with fury, and her eyes lock onto the Sulf second in command with a predatory intensity. The tables turn. The room was thick with tension. After the lady governor's display of raw power, the entire dynamic of the negotiation had shifted. The once confident Sulf delegation now appeared rattled, their natural aggression stifled by the overwhelming presence of the Terran leaders, particularly the towering lady governor, who had single-handedly defeated one of their best with a casual, yet devastating, slap. The Sulf captain, his dark eyes gleaming with rage and humiliation, snarled low, but dared not move. The Sulf shock troopers shifted uneasily at his side, clearly unwilling to provoke the Terrans any further. Their second-in-command lay crumpled on the floor, unconscious and broken, a symbol of the Sulf's vulnerability. The protagonist, still stationed by the translator, couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. They had hoped for this, hoped that the Terrans would prove strong enough to stand against a Sulf empire. Now they were watching the Sulf, for once, cower before a greater force. But there was still a long way to go. The lady governor stood with her fists still planted on her hips, staring down at the Sulf captain as if daring him to try something. The Terran diplomat, now free from his failed attempt at mediation, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Well," he began, trying to ease the tension, "I think we've made our point. Lady Governor, perhaps we should allow the Sulf to offer their explanation for the unprovoked attack on your world." The lady governor snorted, her deep voice a rumble that echoed through the room. "They can explain, but I'll be listening very closely," she replied, her glare never leaving the Sulf captain. Her massive form remained rigid, every muscle tense and ready for action. The Sulf captain, still fuming, finally stepped forward. He straightened himself, his sharp teeth visible as he curled his lips in a snarl. We are not here to explain ourselves to prey, he spat, the words dripping with contempt. We are here to negotiate terms. The Sulf Empire does not submit, ever. We only discuss peace when it is convenient for us. The Terran admiral, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, authoritative, and cutting. Convenient? He echoed. It seems your forces have already been soundly beaten. Your first and second armies were decimated by our defense fleets. So tell me, Captain, what exactly makes you think you have the upper hand here? The Sulf captain's eyes flared with anger, but his reply was forced, his arrogance now more fragile than before. The Sulf do not rely on individual battles. We are an empire. One setback does not determine the course of a war. Setback? The Terran diplomat interrupted, incredulous. Your armies were nearly wiped out. We let you live long enough to have this meeting because we're not in the business of mass extermination. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. But that can change. The Sulf captain bared his teeth in response, but the rest of the Sulf delegation was unnervingly silent. They were waiting for their leader to save face, but the unease in the room was palpable. The Terrans had already demonstrated their strength, and now they were negotiating from a position of undeniable superiority. The protagonist, standing in the background, felt a strange mix of emotions. They were technically part of the Sulf delegation, a slave forced into this role, but in their heart, they were rooting for the Terrans. Watching the Sulf captain squirm gave them an unexpected sense of justice. Finally, these brutal conquerors were facing a power they couldn't simply crush underfoot. As the silence stretched, the Sulf captain shifted his stance and tried a different approach. If you allow us to withdraw peacefully, he began, his tone slightly softer, we will not seek retribution. The Sulf Empire can live alongside your people, for now. The Terran captain, who had remained calm throughout the proceedings, gave a small laugh. Retribution? Captain, you're not in a position to make threats. We've seen what your empire is capable of: subjugation, slavery, pillaging resources. We don't negotiate with bullies who only pretend to seek peace when it suits them. The Terran admiral leaned forward, locking eyes with the Sulf captain. The question isn't whether we'll allow you to retreat, Captain. It's whether your empire will survive long enough to regret this encounter. At that, the room fell silent again. The Sulf captain looked like he wanted to tear into the Terrans, but he knew he was outmatched. His claws flexed at his side, and his yellow eyes flickered with rage, but his situation was rapidly deteriorating. The protagonist knew the next moments would be critical. The Sulf, notorious for their pride, would rather die than admit defeat. But the Terrans were clearly pushing them toward that brink. If a fight broke out here, the Sulf captain would not stand a chance, and his remaining forces would be obliterated. But before the tension could escalate further, the Lady Governor spoke again, her voice a booming command. Enough with this posturing. Either the Sulf admit their defeat, or we settle this the old-fashioned way. The Terran admiral raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the suggestion, but the Terran diplomat stepped in before the situation could spiral into violence. We're offering you a way out, Captain, he said. Surrender, withdraw your forces, and your empire can live to fight another day. Refuse, and you'll join your second-in-command on the floor. The Sulf captain, seething, clenched his fists. It was clear he was weighing his options. His pride demanded that he refuse, that he fight to the bitter end. But his survival instincts were warring with that same pride. The protagonist watched, heart pounding, knowing that the captain's decision would determine the fate of not just the Sulf, but perhaps the entire galaxy. The room was poised on a knife's edge, and one wrong move would plunge them all into chaos. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Sulf captain growled low in his throat and bowed his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the inevitable. Very well, he snarled. We will withdraw, but know this, the Sulf Empire never forgets. The Terran diplomat smiled thinly. Good. Then remember this day well, Captain, because it marks the end of your reign of terror." With that, the Sulf delegation, beaten and humiliated, turned and left the room. The protagonist, though still technically their prisoner, felt the weight of years of oppression lift just slightly from their shoulders. As the doors closed behind the Sulf, the Lady Governor let out a long breath and turned to the Terran leaders. "Well, that was satisfying," she said, her voice lighter now. "I haven't had a good fight in a while." The Terran admiral chuckled. "Let's hope it stays that way, Governor." But the protagonist knew better. The Sulf Empire was wounded, but it wasn't dead. And this skirmish, though a victory for the Terrans, was just the beginning of something far larger. The real war was yet to come. Aftermath and uncertainty. As the Sulf delegation exited, leaving behind only the echoes of their retreating footsteps, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted from tense confrontation to cautious relief. The Terran leaders, though outwardly calm, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had achieved a significant victory today, but the battle was far from over. The protagonist, still stationed by the translator, felt their body unclench slightly. The Sulf were gone for now, but the reality of the situation was settling in. They knew the Sulf Empire would not forget this humiliation. If anything, their defeat today would only fuel their desire for revenge. The Terran diplomat turned to the Lady Governor, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "That was effective," he said, gesturing to the crumpled form of the Sulf second in command, still unconscious on the floor. "You've definitely made an impression." The Lady Governor cracked a grin, the tension from the confrontation easing off her large frame. "I'd say so," she replied, her voice back to its usual gruff but good-natured tone. "Though I was hoping for a little more of a challenge. The Sulf are all bark, no bite." The Terran admiral shook his head with a wry smile. "Don't underestimate them just yet. The Sulf Empire may have been bruised today, but they're far from defeated. They'll regroup, and when they do, they'll come at us with everything they have." The Lady Governor nodded, her smile fading as she considered the truth of his words. "I know," she said, her tone more serious now. "We've bought ourselves time, but not peace. We need to be ready for when they strike again." The protagonist found themselves nodding in agreement. For years, they had been a tool in the hands of the Sulf, used to translate their demands, to facilitate their conquests. But today, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they had seen the Sulf falter. And yet, they knew all too well that the Sulf Empire was relentless. This defeat would sting them, yes, but it would also galvanize them. The Terran leaders gathered around the central table, the holographic map of the galaxy still hovering above them, its glowing lines marking the contested territories between the Sulf and the Terran Federation. The protagonist watched as the Terrans began to strategize. "We need to fortify our borders immediately," the admiral said, pointing to key systems along the Sulf's path of retreat. "They'll try to strike back where we're weakest. We can't afford to lose any more territory." The Lady Governor nodded. "Agreed. We should also send a message to our allies. Let them know what happened here today. They'll want to prepare their own defenses." The diplomat added, "And we should reach out to the neutral systems, see if this display of Sulf vulnerability will push them to our side. We need to rally as many as we can before the Sulf Empire regroups." As the Terrans discussed their plans, the protagonist felt a growing sense of unease. They had long been a passive observer, trapped in the middle of this galactic conflict, but now something had changed. Today, they had witnessed the strength of humanity, but also the fragility of this hard-won victory. Finally, the Lady Governor turned to the protagonist, her large form looming over them, but not unkindly. "What about you?" she asked, her deep voice thoughtful. "You've been stuck translating for those scum for how long?" The protagonist blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. 7 years, they replied quietly. 7 years in their service. The Lady Governor folded her arms, her expression serious. "You're free now, you know that, right? The Terran Federation doesn't enslave people. You can walk out of here, and no one will stop you. The protagonist felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Freedom. It was a concept they had almost forgotten after so many years of subjugation under the Sulf. The weight of that realization was overwhelming. They could leave, finally escape the nightmare that had defined their life for so long. But then, as they glanced around the room at the Terran leaders, something else stirred within them. They had been a prisoner for so long, forced to aid the Sulf in their conquests, but now they had a chance to do something more, to fight back, to help the Terrans push back against the Empire that had taken everything from them. "I appreciate the offer," the protagonist began, their voice steady. "But I don't want to walk away. Not yet. The Sulf took everything from me, and now that I've seen what you can do, what humans can do, I want to help. I want to fight." The Lady Governor smiled, a wide, toothy grin that made her look even more imposing. "Now that's what I like to hear," she said with a nod. "You've seen the enemy up close. You know how they operate. We could use someone like you." The Admiral raised an eyebrow. "It's dangerous, you know. The Sulf will come for you again. They won't forget that you've switched sides." The protagonist took a deep breath, their decision solidifying in their mind. "Let them come. I've lived under their heel for too long. I'd rather die fighting than go back to that." The Terran diplomat smiled, impressed by their resolve. "You're braver than most," he said. "Welcome to the Resistance." With that, the protagonist felt a new sense of purpose settle over them. The future was uncertain, the Sulf would undoubtedly strike back, and the galaxy would soon be plunged into deeper conflict. But for the first time in years, they were no longer a helpless pawn in this war. They were free, and they would fight for a better future, one where the Sulf Empire would no longer cast its shadow over the stars. As the Terran leaders continued to plan, the protagonists silently vowed to themselves that they would see the Sulf defeated, no matter the cost. Rising tides of war, the days following the Sulf Empire's humiliating retreat were filled with preparation and whispers of coming war. Across the Terran Federation, news of the victory spread quickly, lighting a flame of hope among the many planets and species oppressed by the Sulf. For the protagonist, life had changed dramatically. No longer a captive forced to facilitate the Sulf's expansion, they were now part of something larger, the Terran Resistance. The decision to stay and fight alongside humanity had given them purpose, but it had also put them at the center of a dangerous game, one where both sides were gathering their strength for the inevitable clash.